Okay, so transition economies, and by this we mean economies that are um, moving from command or planned to market economic systems. So the idea here is, and we're going to talk about the effects of such a transition, that we're going to be focusing more on the short-term effects that come about that are more pertinent to the transition itself rather than to the market economic system. We aren't a market economy, but we're getting there. So this would involve stuff like greater reliance to the price mechanism, privatization by selling off state-owned enterprises and stuff of that sort, deregulation, all of that type of stuff. However, what are the effects? And these are mainly the negative effects, right? Of this particular of such transitions. So first thing you have are structural changes, because now you're producing uh, according to the market mechanism, right? You're producing stuff that the consumers want according to demand supply conditions, which should be extremely different than what the government wanted you to produce. The government might have wanted a large amount of capital goods to be produced. The market doesn't want that. So now you're going to undergo structural changes as you start to change, you start to revert to different production processes of different goods. Because of that, you have what we can call structural unemployment. You don't need to know the term, but the idea here is that it's unemployment due to structural changes within the industry, because labor needs to be retrained in order to produce something different, right? The person producing machines can't possibly go into the service sector and become a doctor or whatever. Like, the idea is it needs time. So in the short run, you would have some amount of unemployment. You would have structural changes, and again, this leads to one thing that this leads to is structural unemployment. Another thing it leads to is inefficiency, because it goes without saying, the person because you're removing labor from some industries and putting them into new industries. um, Even if they have the bare minimum skills to produce those goods and services, because they're not specialized in in the production of such products, because they don't have skills at the level where you might want them to have, they might have been more efficient producing what they're producing in the planned economic system, because they were used to it, because they had been doing so for some while, because they had been trained to produce whatever they were doing there. Now that you've shifted them to a completely different production process, uh, and they're not either not specialized in it, and B, they might not even be skilled or trained according to it, there is going to be inefficiency. Um, right? So secondly, you would have inflation. Why is that? Because price controls are removed, um, and subsidies are either decreased slash removed, because the government is no longer as influential in controlling price. If you have all of this, so again, you would have an increase in inflation. You also, well, we've already talked about unemployment above, with regards to structural unemployment. So you would have unemployment, and why is that? Well, one is obviously you would have structural unemployment. Another reason is because private firms, as they usually prefer capital intensive production methods because they are more efficient, or are usually more efficient. So private firms might shed excess labor, and that also leads to unemployment, which could further lead to industrial action. So industrial action, industrial unrest. So like things like strikes, all of that type of stuff, because workers are angry. Because they're insecure about, they're worried about their jobs and job security in general, right? Um, and another thing is about growing income inequality. And the reason why this would start to grow in the short term as well is because you the I mean, so welfare projects, welfare payments projects, payments, so stuff like unemployment benefits, stuff like expenditure on public services like free hospitals, free healthcare, free education, all of that. These all decrease, or they might, uh, you know, completely be removed. But since we're talking about a transition, we're not too sure about it. So it could. The idea here is that what you can say for sure is the income is that inequality definitely increases. We can also talk about the balance of payment. Um, so, for example, let's take five. So BOP moves towards disequilibrium. Um, well, in fact, let's scrap this because we already have 4 points. And the balance of payment is going to be a little tricky at this particular point because we haven't really studied. Well, I'm assuming that if you're just going through it chronologically, it's definitely a macro chapter. But the idea here is if you're that now, since you're not you're not really producing tailored to the balance of payment, right? So there'll be stuff like imports, a lot of consumer imports. There'll be stuff, if anything, you would even you might even be importing capital because now home or domestic production processes have changed to producing more consumer based products because that's what the market mechanism wants of you. But anyhow, you do have four things, and these are four disadvantages, four effects. They are do have negative connotations, but that's just the nature of transition economies. So they can ask this at times in a case study or in a MCQ. They rarely ask this in a proper section B essay question.